Have you ever wondered what really drives male desire, not the polished version we see in movies or the cliches we toss around in conversation, but the raw, unfiltered psychology underneath? In this documentary, we peel back the layers of the male mind to uncover the darker, more complex forces that shape sexual attraction, fantasy, and behavior. It's not just about biology or hormones, it's about power, fear, shame, and the constant tug of war between what men want and what they're taught to want. And sometimes that conflict reveals more about human nature than we're ready to admit. All right, let's start by getting one thing straight. When we talk about male desire, most people think they already know what it is: lust, testosterone, visual stimulation. Simple, right? But here's the thing, that's the surface. What really drives male desire runs far deeper than we tend to admit. It's not just about physical attraction or spontaneous spark, it's about early experiences, the ways boys are socialized, the roles they're told to play, and the invisible emotional maps drawn in their minds long before they ever have their first crush. When I talk to men about desire, it surprises me most isn't what they say they want, it's why they want it. A lot of men describe attraction as this instinctive pull, like gravity. But when we look closer, what we see is that desire isn't just something that happens to them. It's something they've learned to interpret in a specific way. From a psychological standpoint, desire is a combination of memory, meaning, and emotion. It's tied to experiences of comfort, power, and validation. That's why the same man can feel wildly attracted to confidence one moment and vulnerability the next, because both in different ways tap into something deeper he's trying to reconcile within himself. Let me give you an example. Imagine a boy growing up in a family where showing emotion is seen as weakness. He learns early that to be a real man, he has to stay composed, controlled, stoic. Now, fast forward 20 years, he's an adult, and he finds himself inexplicably drawn to women who express deep emotion, who cry openly, laugh loudly, feel everything fully. On the surface, it looks like he's attracted to passion. But underneath, there's something else going on. That woman represents the emotional freedom he was never allowed to have. His desire isn't just sexual, it's psychological. It's a longing to connect with the parts of himself he's been trained to suppress. This is what I mean when I say male desire isn't purely instinctive. It's a reflection of early emotional conditioning. The things that turn men on often have less to do with sex and more to do with what sex means to them. For some, it's validation, proof that they're desirable, that they're enough. For others, it's power, the sense of control they rarely feel elsewhere. And for some, it's escape, a way to momentarily shut off the noise of insecurity and feel something primal, unfiltered, real. Now, here's the paradox. Men are told from a young age that desire is their defining trait, that wanting sex is what makes them men. But at the same time, they're told that their desires are dangerous, that they need to control them, hide them, manage them. That creates a kind of psychological split, one part of them craving freedom, the other fearing judgment. This internal tug of war gives rise to what I call the performance of desire. It's not about what a man feels anymore, it's about what he thinks he's supposed to feel. Think about how that shows up in everyday life. In conversations with men, I often hear phrases like, I know I shouldn't find that attractive, but I do, or I don't know why I always go for women like that. What's really happening there is cognitive dissonance, the clash between cultural conditioning and authentic feeling. Men are constantly trying to reconcile what society tells them desire should look like with what their psyche actually craves. And that gap, that uncomfortable tension, is where so much of the dark psychology of male desire lies. One of the most fascinating findings from sexual psychology research is that men's arousal patterns aren't as simple as we once thought. Yes, visual stimuli play a role. The human brain is wired to respond to novelty, to shapes, to movement. But beneath that, there's a world of nuance. Men's arousal is influenced by emotional context, by power dynamics, by memories of early experiences that shape their concept of intimacy. In other words, what turns men on often reflects the stories their minds have been telling them for years, stories about who they are allowed to be and who they're not. Let's talk about the power dynamic for a moment, because it's often misunderstood. People hear power and assume dominance, aggression, control, but in reality, power in sexual psychology is about significance. Feeling seen, feeling capable, feeling wanted. Many men, especially those who grew up equating masculinity with strength, find themselves sexually drawn to situations or partners that allow them to feel powerful, not necessarily to dominate. It's the psychological compensation for all the moments in life where they felt small, overlooked, or helpless. On the other end of the spectrum, There are men who find vulnerability arousing, who are drawn to surrender, to being desired, to giving up control. And while some might label that as unmanly, it's actually an incredibly human form of expression. Yeah. For men who've spent their lives being expected to lead, protect, and perform, moments of surrender can feel profoundly liberating. Sex becomes a rare space where they can safely experience emotional nakedness. There's also an evolutionary layer here, but it's not as straightforward as we like to think. Sure, we can talk about testosterone, reproduction, and biological drives, but biology doesn't tell the full story. Evolution doesn't just shape the body, it shapes the brain, especially the parts that respond to connection and meaning. Men evolved not only to seek partners, but to form bonds, to feel needed, to be chosen. And yet, in modern culture, we've reduced that complexity to a caricature, the idea that men only want sex and not intimacy. In reality, many men experience desire as a pathway to intimacy, not a substitute for it. When I conducted research on sexual fantasies, one of the most striking things I found was how many men's fantasies were less about sex itself and more about the emotions surrounding it, feeling wanted, admired, or even overwhelmed by someone's desire for them. These fantasies often reveal hidden emotional themes: the need for affirmation, the longing for connection, the thrill of being desired. In that sense, fantasy isn't an escape from reality, it's a mirror of it. Now, here's where it gets dark, not in a sinister way, but in a shadow sense. The parts of male desire that society teaches men to hide often grow stronger in the dark. Shame amplifies desire. When something feels taboo, it becomes charged, electrified. That's why men who feel ashamed of certain fantasies often find them even harder to resist. It's not that the desire itself is wrong, it's that the suppression gives it power. The forbidden becomes magnetic. You see, the human brain doesn't differentiate between moral good and bad when it comes to arousal. It responds to intensity, to emotional charge. A forbidden desire, a dangerous scenario, a moment of vulnerability, all of these activate the same neurochemical circuits that process fear and excitement. That's why desire can feel confusing, even frightening. It's not just pleasure we're responding to, it's adrenaline, dopamine, oxytocin, the cocktail of emotional meaning wrapped inside physical sensation. This is why we can't talk about male desire without talking about shame. From a young age, men learn that expressing desire can make them appear weak, creepy, or out of control. So they internalize it. They learn to channel it through humor, bravado, or silence. Over time, those layers of self-protection make it harder to understand what they actually want. Many men don't explore their own desires. They perform them, and that performance, that disconnection between what they feel and what they express, becomes the source of immense psychological tension. I've spoken to countless men who say things like, I don't even know what turns me on anymore. That statement is rarely about physical confusion. It's about emotional detachment. When desire is constantly filtered through cultural expectations, men stop listening to the subtle cues of their own bodies. They forget that arousal isn't just a reaction, it's communication. The body is always sending signals, revealing truths that the conscious mind might not yet be ready to face. So what happens when a man starts to peel back those layers? When he stops asking, what should I want? And starts asking, what do I actually feel? Often, what surfaces first is discomfort, because underneath the learned desire lies fear, vulnerability, sometimes even grief. But with awareness comes transformation. When men learn to see their desire not as a problem to be controlled, but as a map of their emotional landscape, it opens the door to a more authentic kind of sexuality. One of the most fascinating things about human psychology is that desire can change when the emotional context changes. A man who's always been drawn to control might find that as he heals his relationship with vulnerability, his arousal shifts toward emotional intimacy. Another man might realize that what he once labeled as kinks were really expressions of unmet needs for validation or connection. The more emotionally aware a person becomes, the more their desire evolves, not weaker, but richer, more nuanced, more alive. Here's a truth that often surprises people: the healthiest forms of desire often have their roots in darkness. Our shadow selves, the parts we hide, deny, or fear, hold enormous creative energy. When we bring those shadows into the light, we don't lose control, we gain clarity. Desire stops being a source of confusion and becomes a language of self-understanding. So if we want to understand the dark psychology of male desire, we have to stop asking what men want and start asking why they want it. What emotional story are they trying to rewrite through their attractions? What unmet need is being whispered through their fantasies? Every desire tells a story, not about lust, but about longing. And when men learn to listen to that story without shame, they move closer to the kind of connection they've been chasing all along, not just with others, but with themselves. In the end, male desire isn't dark because it's dangerous. It's dark because it's hidden, buried beneath layers of conditioning, shame, and silence. But when we dare to explore it with honesty and compassion, we discover that even in the shadows, There's light, the light of self awareness, healing, and genuine intimacy. And maybe that's the most powerful truth of all understanding desire isn't about control. It's about coming home to the most human parts of ourselves, the ones that have always been there, quietly asking to be seen. Let's start with a question that's a little uncomfortable. Why do so many men struggle to fully understand or express their sexual desires, even though they've been told all their lives that men are the ones who want sex the most? It's ironic, isn't it? The very thing men are supposedly built for, desire, is also the thing they most often misunderstand or feel conflicted about. Beneath the surface of confidence and control, there's often a quiet confusion, even fear. Because for many men, the darker side of desire doesn't come from aggression or lust, it comes from repression, from years of hiding, suppressing, and performing. We tend to talk about male sexuality as if it's something mechanical, driven purely by hormones. Testosterone equals libido, libido equals pursuit. But the truth is far more complex. The male body doesn't operate in isolation from the mind. Emotions, memories, and social conditioning all weave themselves into the experience of arousal. When those elements are ignored, when emotions are silenced, what emerges is not healthy desire, it's distorted desire, the kind that's disconnected from empathy, from self-awareness, from vulnerability. From an early age, boys are taught strange kind of paradox. They're told to control their emotions, but express their sexuality, to be strong, decisive, and dominant, but never needy, never uncertain, never too gentle. It's like being handed a fire and told, you can use this, but never let anyone see you warm yourself by it. So they learn to channel emotion through physicality. Desire becomes the language through which they express what they can't say. Affection, fear, loneliness, longing. It's not that men want sex too much. It's that they've been given too few ways to express their need for closeness. I remember talking to a man during one of my research interviews who said something that stuck with me for years. He said, I don't know if I want sex or if I just want to feel seen. That statement hits deep because it captures something profoundly human. For him, sex wasn't about pleasure. It was about validation, about being recognized, desired, accepted. And when you think about it, that's not unique to him. So much of male desire is tied to the question, am I enough? Sex becomes proof. Each encounter, each fantasy, a silent experiment in self-worth. But here's where the repression becomes dangerous. When men aren't taught to understand the emotional roots of their desire, they start to mistake the symptom for the need. They think sex itself will fill the void that only connection can. It's like drinking salt water when you're thirsty. It looks like relief, but it only deepens the dehydration. And because they're taught to separate sex from emotion, many men end up in a cycle of craving intensity instead of intimacy. They chase the next high, the next conquest, not realizing that what they're really chasing is a feeling of wholeness that can't be found through physical release alone. This isn't weakness. It's conditioning. Decades of cultural messages have told men that vulnerability equals failure, that if they admit to loneliness, fear, or insecurity, they'll lose respect. So they bury those emotions. But emotions don't disappear. They just find other ways to express themselves in the realm of sexuality that often means those unprocessed feelings surface as fantasy fixation or even aggression. The repression doesn't kill desire, it distorts it. There's actually fascinating research showing how emotional suppression changes the body's response to arousal. Studies using brain imaging reveal that when people consciously suppress emotions, the amygdala, the part of the brain tied to fear and desire, becomes more reactive. In men, this heightened reactivity often gets misinterpreted as sexual tension when in fact it's emotional anxiety. The body is saying something's unresolved, but because men have been taught to translate all intense feelings as sexual, the message gets scrambled. What feels like desire may actually be an emotional echo of something deeper: stress, fear, loneliness, or even grief. And here's where the darker edge of male desire begins to show, not in cruelty or dominance, in confusion, in the inability to differentiate between wanting connection and needing control. When emotional expression is off limits, control becomes the substitute. Sex becomes a safe space to feel, even if that feeling is disguised as dominance. In that moment, a man who has spent his life repressing emotion finally feels alive, powerful, seen. It's not that he craves power itself, it's that he craves freedom from emotional numbness. That's why so many fantasies revolve around control, submission, or intensity. They're not just about pleasure, they're about reclaiming a sense of emotional reality. A man who's always been in control might fantasize about losing it. A man who's always felt powerless might dream of being worshipped. These fantasies are not random. They're symbolic stories that psyche tells to balance itself. The shadow of repression creates the light of fantasy. And when you think about it from a psychological lens, it makes perfect sense. The more you repress an emotion, the stronger it becomes. The brain seeks equilibrium. If you suppress vulnerability in daily life, you'll crave it in fantasy. If you suppress fear, you'll seek thrill. If you suppress sadness, you look for passion. Desire becomes the unconscious language through which the mind speaks its truth. But society rarely lets men decode that language. Instead, it shames them for it. A man admits he has a dark fantasy, and suddenly he's judged or ridiculed. So he hides it. That secrecy feeds shame, and shame feeds arousal. The forbidden becomes irresistible. This cycle is one of the most fascinating and troubling aspects of male sexuality. The more something is repressed, the more power it gains. It's not about morality, it's about the way the human mind processes forbidden pleasure. The same neural pathways that light up for fear also light up for sexual excitement. The brain doesn't know the difference between danger and thrill, it only knows intensity. That's why taboos are so powerful. Now imagine living a life where the only safe place to feel intense emotion is in sex. That's where many men unconsciously end up. Every emotion they've been taught to suppress, sadness, guilt, vulnerability, gets channeled through desire. Sex becomes therapy, confession, and escape all at once. But the relief is temporary, because without emotional literacy, the cycle repeats. Repression, expression, release, regret, round and round it goes. It's not just psychological, it's biological too. Chronic emotional suppression raises cortisol, the body's stress hormone. Elevated cortisol can lower testosterone, affect sleep, and even disrupt arousal patterns. So the very act of denying emotion can literally dampen sexual desire over time, or make it swing unpredictably between extremes. One moment numbness, the next obsession. That's the body trying to compensate for what the mind refuses to process. When men begin to unpack this, when they start to understand that their sexual behavior is often a mirror of their emotional state, something incredible happens. They stop fearing their desires and start listening to them. They realize that desire isn't the enemy, repression is. The goal isn't to eliminate fantasy or control every impulse, but to understand what those impulses are saying. Because every desire, even the darkest, carries a message. Maybe it's saying, I want to feel needed. Maybe it's saying, I want to be vulnerable without being hurt. Or maybe it's saying, I just want to be real. There's a term in psychology called affective deprivation. It describes what happens when someone is starved of emotional expression for so long that they start seeking stimulation through intensity, conflict, sex, risk, adrenaline. Many men live in a state of affective deprivation without realizing it. They've learned to numb their feelings to survive, and then they wonder why they crave intensity in their relationships or sexual lives. The truth is, when you can't feel deeply, you start chasing anything that makes you feel, even if it's destructive. So, what's the way out of this loop? It starts with awareness, not the kind of awareness that comes from self criticism, but from curiosity. Men who take the time to understand their own inner lives often discover that their darkest desires are not dangerous, they're misunderstood. When you strip away the shame and look at the emotion underneath, what you find is often tenderness, loneliness, or a hunger for connection. The darkness softens when it's illuminated by understanding. In the end, the dark psychology of male desire isn't about evil or corruption. It's about the cost of emotional repression. When society tells men to shut down their feelings, it doesn't make them stronger. It makes them disconnected. It teaches them to speak through their bodies instead of their hearts. And that disconnection creates shadows, shadows that follow them into intimacy, into fantasy, into love. But when men learn to embrace those shadows, to see their desires as reflections of unmet emotional truths, something powerful happens. They stop performing masculinity and start living it authentically. They discover that real strength isn't about control, it's about emotional fluency, the ability to feel deeply without fear, to express desire without shame, to connect without losing oneself. The irony is that the moment a man allows himself to truly feel, his desires become less dark, not because they disappear, but because they integrate. They stop being fragmented parts of him and become whole expressions of who he is. And when that happens, sex stops being a way to escape himself and becomes a way to return home to himself. So the next time someone talks about the dark side of male desire, remember this: the darkness isn't in the wanting, it's in the silence. The true danger isn't that men desire too much, it's that they're afraid to feel what their desire is trying to tell them. And once they start listening, really listening, they find that desire isn't a beast to be tamed, but a teacher, one that's been waiting all along to lead them back to the parts of themselves they were never allowed to love.